Welcome to Integration Nation for Allison Sullivan's Integrative Health Team. I'm Dee Daniels. Boundary. It's not a bad word.
It is not a bad word.
I'm so excited about this topic. This is going to be what I'm thinking could be just a part one because it's boundaries. It's big.
It's an immense
to
topic,
yeah.
and I'm sure we'll circle back to it time and time again. It's not a bad word. It does have a bad reputation.
True story. It really does.
Yes. So my goal is hopefully to start to turn that around for a good old boundary today because it does not deserve the bad reputation it has.
You don't need to bleep it out.
No, we should be celebrating boundaries because boundaries keep us safe in relationships, and relationships keep us safe and happy in our lives. So we need them.
We're excited to get into the meat of this, and if you're a vegetarian, into the vegetables of this.
Into the main part of the entree.
We're excited to do that. Also want to mention before we get going that we've had a lot of fun with our Q&A section in every episode here recently. And really, that's a great way to get some very specific questions answered that you may have after you listen to one of the episodes. If you've got a burning question on your heart, drop off that question via email if you want to keep it private, via Instagram. A great place to do it too.
Yeah, and Facebook. You can find us on Facebook. You can contact us directly on the website through the Contact Us button. We are everywhere. You can see me out and about and ask a question.
Which you've had.
Which I have had.
Yes.
I have had, and I welcome. If you're connected to the practice, when you come to see us, you can ask the question or share the comment. We are here to answer you and love connecting with you in all of those ways. Number one, because it builds community and it builds this integration nation, which is the whole point.
Yeah.
And two, it helps us continue to decide what we're going to talk about on these podcasts so you all are really getting what you want.
It's really amazing to see how many people are downloading this podcast. We could not be more thankful for everyone who is not only picking up the podcast for themselves and taking in so many great lessons and using it toward their own journey, but sharing it with other people too.
Absolutely sharing it. You know, then since November, our subscriber and download numbers have tripled.
That's amazing.
Yes.
That's really fantastic. So if you love it, give us a 5-star rating.
And a review. We love that because that helps us to be more visible too, so people can find us. And the mission of this podcast is to educate people on the effectiveness of integrative mental health and to do our part in breaking the stigma about accessing really high quality mental health care. So please share far and wide in support of that.
All right, let's get to it. Boundaries.
Let's do it.
I remember years ago reading a book about boundaries, and it was my first introduction to really breaking down what it's all about. And I realized very quickly I wasn't good at keeping boundaries with myself as well as with other people.
Yes.
It was eye-opening.
Yes. Well, I mean, both are important. We have to have limits. We have to also know where our space starts and stops. Otherwise, things get really chaotic. And the problems in relationships with ourselves and with other people can a lot of times boil down to things that are too rigid or too chaotic. And sometimes I wonder if part of the bad reputation that boundary has is associated with thinking about a boundary as like a brick wall or something really impenetrable to keep people out. And you know, although there are those rare occasions where we have to really set a firm boundary to keep someone out, boundaries really are a healthy foundation for all relationships because it says, this is who I am and this is how far you can come in this way, and this is where I stop as well. So it just is about identity. It's about this is where we can meet and share, and this is where I stay on my own, and this is where you stay on your own.
While you're talking about that, I'm totally thinking about my sister and my nephew. My nephew is in the middle of the beautiful twos.
Ooh, yeah. Yeah.
And boundary has been a word that has been used a lot. And I'm watching this process take place, and he is testing the boundaries, figuring things out.
Yes.
How far can I go? What's the consequence going to be? Learning some things that I think we all go through that process, and we should go through that process and reevaluate our boundaries, I'm thinking, pretty often.
Yeah, and it's a really great example that you brought up with your nephew, because when that starts at around that age, it's because he has a sense of self now. Mm-hmm. And that's what boundaries are inextricably tied to, that sense of self. Oh, I have a will and I'm separate from these people. So where am I in relationship to these people in this circumstance? Mm-hmm. And that's why we need boundaries. If we don't ever know how far we can go or where we need to stop, or in our own personal lives, if we don't let people know what's acceptable and not acceptable for us, and how we feel loved and how we don't, and what works well for us and what doesn't, and what's non-negotiable, then it's really hard to have satisfying relationships. It's really easy to have a lot of resentment and trust issues in those circumstances, but it's really not easy to have satisfying relationships because nobody knows where anybody's at.
I know you talk about that there are different types of boundaries, and I think that's a good way to really figure out, what you might need to work on in the boundary department is to know what section am I even in.
Yes. And, similar to how we did that in the self-care episode, I think it's as important in this boundary episode, because that can really be overwhelming for people, especially if they're not actively in therapy, working with a therapist, to be like, okay, well, maybe I've got boundary issues, but how do I even know where to begin to look for that? So, just some basic places are physical boundaries, emotional boundaries, psychological boundaries, spiritual boundaries. And we can look in each of those categories and say, so physical boundaries are probably the easiest for people to kind of wrap their heads around. This is actually what kind of touch is okay. This is what kind of touch is not okay. This is what I would prefer. This is what's a no-go zone. Whether that's hugs, whether that's just physical proximity to other people, whatever it is, those are physical boundaries. Emotional boundaries are around privacy, as are psychological. What is allowed to be mine and only mine? What will I share, and how are the circumstances I share those things? And what is okay and not okay for you as the other to be included in?
That's it. I'm a little gray on the emotional and psychological. I could sense that maybe they would overlap a little sometimes.
Yes, they would overlap sometimes, and yet they're separate too. Psychological things can be just about thinking, thoughts, and ways of being, worldviews.
Right.
Emotional boundaries are related to how we're going to be in emotional relationship. Those have to do with anger, expressions of anger, sadness, excitement, all of those very specific emotional words that we're used to. So sometimes it helps to look at how an abuse of a psychological boundary might be. So for people to start to distinguish psychological from emotional. So sometimes in abusive relationships, people will describe that they just don't have any psychological space. They're being hounded on a regular basis of, well, what are you thinking now? What are you thinking about now? What did you do after you did that? What did you do after you did that? Where did you go then? Who were you with? What were you doing? What are you doing at work? How much effort and time are you spending on this project? What's that? That kind of peppering with just every detail of someone's life and what they're thinking about it.
That can be wow. That can be a hard thing to come up out of. if you are dealing with that.
Yes. So in a non-pathological way, how that might look to set a boundary in that way is, let's say someone you're close to starts asking you, 20 questions about your day. Starts texting you, let's say, oh, what are you doing now? 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 Where'd you go now? That might be a place for a psychological boundary, because if you start feeling really crowded up in your head or feel this obligation to just keep giving them the information because that's the polite thing to do, that's an indication that there's a psychological boundary that needs to be set. And it can be set really easily. You know what? Hey, don't take it personally, but I like a little more space during my day. So if I don't respond to these texts, that's about me.
That's good.
That's a boundary that lets the other person know why you're not responding and what's important to you as a person, how you are in the world. That's the essence of a boundary.
And for those of us in relationships, this may have come up, this kind of boundary, and where is the boundary, and this may have come up. I think also a good way to kind of communicate that might be to say, I like to share this with you at the end of the day.
Yes.
Sometimes that's hard to do as you're doing the day because you're not in the moment of your day. It sort of takes away from you being in the moment of your day.
Yes, which is another point about a boundary. If you're sensing an intrusion of some sort, if whatever's going on, whether it's physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, if something just feels off for you, that's an indication that a boundary is needed. If you're like, ugh, or why does this keep happening? Or I don't understand, how come I have to keep doing this? Those types of thoughts are often an indicator that there's a boundary issue.
I'm interested too in finding out hearing some examples of spiritual boundaries.
That can be as far and wide, really, as you can imagine. But sometimes this comes up in couples where there's a faith diversity, a spiritual belief diversity, a religious diversity. Maybe one person has a religious belief system and religious practices in a religious community, and maybe the other person is more spiritually based. And so how that gets navigated in the couple relationship is about spiritual boundaries. Where are you allowed in this part of my life? And how much of this part of my life do I want to keep to myself?
You have a really great breakdown of some of the symptoms of boundary issues and knowing how we can see those, be alerted to that a little more.
So, yes, in a really general sense, what I just said about if you have a sense of some kind of intrusion or some kind of heaviness or a vague awareness of, this keeps happening to me, that's probably an indication that there's a boundary issue. Additionally, if you're really stressed in one area of your life, a piece of that is probably attributable to a boundary issue. Financial stuff usually has a boundary component. Fatigue, and chronic fatigue, chronic resentment, codependence is all about boundaries. Substance abuse, boundaries. Depression, anxiety, this sense of, why do these people keep doing this to me? That kind of, people don't like to think of it as a victimhood mentality, but that kind of, why do they keep doing this to me, is usually about a boundary too.
It's an interesting thread that runs through all of that, a very common thread that runs through all of those things that you mentioned, that so much of it comes down to the boundaries that we're setting.
Yes, and as so often happens in the conversations that you and I have, some of this can go all the way back to our families of origin, in how that started to get communicated to us at your nephew's age.
Yeah.
Where are we allowed space? And how can we say that we need space? And how is that responded to when we say that? It can boil all the way back down to that. And then you can think about in elementary school, if somebody took a pencil off your desk.
Right.
or somebody was, what are you allowed to do? And how are you allowed to say that? And there's all kinds of gender considerations along with this too. Typically, not exclusively, but typically boundaries can be more difficult for women to navigate because they are less reinforced typically, meaning by the culture at large. So if a man sets a boundary, a lot of times it can be viewed as a sign of strength and someone who really knows who they are and where they're going and what they want. If a woman does it, sometimes it's not really viewed that way. Sometimes it's viewed as, wow, she's a real, you know what, or, oh my gosh, she's mean, or, she's just, she's a hard, you know what. So there's all kinds of things to look at and examine and explore related to boundaries.
There are a lot of misconceptions.
A lot of misconceptions about boundaries. If you set boundaries, you don't want people in your life. If you set boundaries, you're super harsh. If you set boundaries, you're a mean person.
Yeah.
We could go on and on and on.
We could. Yeah. I so many times have run into that. And a lot of that, I think, fell for me in the category of, you're too strong of a female. You're being too much of this.
Too strong of a female. Oh, that just made me sick to my stomach.
Doesn't it make your skin crawl? I mean, it's just...
What does that even mean?
You're too young to be, this kind of leader in this situation. There are so many examples, I think, that, we could go to regarding what sort of bats us down from setting boundaries, because socially it's not being accepted correctly, or it's being looked at by the wrong people in the wrong way.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a really important point about when people start to reshape boundaries or more explicitly be in relationship with boundaries, there's going to be some pushback, because if people are getting reinforced and rewarded for exploitative behavior, they're going to balk a little bit at that when people start setting healthier boundaries for themselves. And that's actually, I would encourage people to consider that as maybe some evidence that they're doing something that's healthy for themselves. However, I need to also say that there's a lot of good people out there. And a lot of times when people do start to set more boundaries in their lives, it's well received and they experience such immediate relief. It becomes really self-reinforcing pretty quickly.
You know how almost every episode we have, Allison, we come up with a bumper sticker that we're going to have.
Yes.
I just came up with a new one. Push through the pushback. Isn't that brilliant?
Don't anyone steal that.
Trademark. Yes.
Trademark again. Integration Nation. Push through the pushback. Yes.
Because you're right. It really can obviously go either way depending on the people that you are around as you're setting boundaries. But, I'm thinking about so many situations where we do get pushback. And, I mean, okay, mom to the 2-year-old, getting a little pushback there because he's a 2-year-old.
And that's what he's supposed to do, because he's mapping in his brain where he is and where everybody else is in relation to him.
In your intimate relationship, you're setting boundaries, uncomfortable conversations.
Those sweaty 10-minute conversations no one wants to have.
Exactly. Push through the pushback,
Yes!
because you're going to get some pushback. The other person's going to be defensive and walls are going to come up and things are going to shift and move and adjust. But if they're healthy boundaries, you have to push through in that moment.
And ultimately, they'll make the relationship healthier and more satisfying for both people, because it's not taking anything away of value and meaning from another person when you set a boundary like that. It just actually makes the channel for connection clearer. I really want to say that again, because that's really the point. It makes the channel for connection clearer. And that's what we all want. We do not want to be disconnected. We don't want to be isolated. we don't want to be set off from. We want to be connected in ways that feel mutually rewarding. And without boundaries, we can't have it. With boundaries, we really have a good shot at getting that. And that's the whole point, I think.
It's like you're walking that path, with your whoever, significant other or your child or your friend or your boss or your parents, doesn't matter. You're walking that path, right? And it's like, it's really crowded
with a lot of underbrush and
right, like no one has been there to clear it for a long time.
Yes.
But you go in with some really clear boundaries, healthy boundaries, and you start to clear some of that, and it makes it a much easier walk.
And you know where it is safe to walk.
Yeah.
So you can enjoy the walk together because you're not stepping on each other's toes. You're not bumping into each other. You're not getting smacked in the face with the tree limbs and the other stuff that's around there. So that's how my point in really having this first podcast on boundaries was for people to get that in their hearts and their minds, that's the point. The point is not to do one more hard thing I've got to struggle through. The point is to clear a path that feels good so everybody can safely connect, because that's when we can supercharge our lives.
Isn't a big part of setting boundaries and setting healthy boundaries and figuring out that process and what it looks like, isn't a big part of that being a good communicator, like knowing how to communicate those boundaries, getting a little bit better at that communication piece?
Yes, and that takes practice. I don't want anybody listening to think, oh, there's my loophole. I'm not a good communicator,
so I don't have to do it.
Can't do it.
Nah, I'm out.
Opt out. Because I want you to have happy relationships outside of yourself, as well as having a happy relationship inside yourself. And so wrestling with boundaries has to happen, and communication develops with practice. Mm-hmm. So I think that, and what I tell clients when we're up against this in session is start small. Don't go for the biggest, most complicated, difficult boundary issue you have in your life. Start small. So maybe it's something like, okay, I'll give you an example from my marriage. Meal times. We have really different ideas about meal times, especially dinner. My husband likes to eat later. No problem with that. Doesn't think twice about it. I'm not that kind of person. I really like to finish eating by 7:00. Mm-hmm. Usually, in my typical routine, because that's how I know my body operates best. Then I get up in the morning, I'm hungry. That's my thing. Mm-hmm. So when we were first together, that became a weird thing between us.
Yeah. As it does for so many couples.
As it does for so many couples.
Yeah.
Until we had the conversation, hey, this is when I typically like to eat, and these are the reasons why. And then we were able to figure out how to create a safe system around that felt really good. So he wasn't walking around going, oh my gosh, why are we eating early bird specials all the time? And I wasn't walking around going, oh my gosh, why are we eating at bedtime?
Yeah.
And freaking out. So start with something small like that in your relationship that really is pretty easily to navigate.
It really is. It's a meaningful statement, and you've said it before, and it really does kind of tie together everything we've been talking about with boundaries. I love this statement. No is a complete sentence.
Yes, and that is not my thought. The masterful Virginia Satir, who was a renowned therapist in the 70s and 80s, who is no longer with us, did a lot of work in experiential based therapy and a lot of work in boundaries and assertive communication, and she really pioneered that in our common language, really allowing people to understand that no is a complete sentence. That's it.
A lot of people think they can somehow move around that, or
that it's mean. That's what I come up
Yeah.
against, that it's mean. So if somebody asks me, hey, can you do blah, blah, blah on Saturday?
Mm-hmm.
It's perfectly appropriate for me to go, oh, no, done. But I'm watching your face as I'm saying that. There's a lot of dead air after that.
Yes.
It feels weird at first.
It does.
But also you saw my face and you saw the expression.
Yeah.
So you get the context. It's not like I'm looking at you with scorn and contempt.
It's not like you're laughing afterwards
like,
and saying,
no,
not interested. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not about that. But the point is you don't have to justify and you don't have to give an explanation. And that's because we are each allowed personal space. And we're each allowed privacy. We don't have to explain the ins and outs of every one of our decisions, but our thinking that we do is a really clear indication of a boundary issue.
Wow, that's big. That's big. Do you want to get to Q&A?
Let's do it.
All right. We had a question that actually you got in person, I believe, this question. It was a really great question.
Really great question. It came up several times about the nice, is it truly kind to be nice episode.
Mm-hmm. Great episode.
So, yes, if you haven't listened to that, go back and listen to it. I think it may be actually kind of a companion episode to this because they are cousins, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
So the most heard comment from this was, okay, so I've figured out I'm being nice in a situation. I'm being agreeable when maybe that's not really authentic. In that moment, what do I do? How do I switch over into a kind response instead of just kind of being like a deer in the headlights? That's basically the comment.
So the immediate moment is the hard moment.
The immediate moment, because you're stuck. And this is so important because this relates back to parenting too. A lot of times when parents have good intentions of guiding their child's behavior, they'll say where you don't go, but they won't say where else you can go. You know, they'll say to their child, no, we don't do that.
Right.
Without a replacement. And this speaks to that. So it's an excellent point that I really want to address. And I think the first thing we need to do in that moment is to give ourselves a heaping dose of compassion because we're beginners in that moment. We're trying something new. It feels awkward. The awkward beauty of beginnings.
Yeah, right. True.
It feels awkward. So that dose of compassion is going to settle us down enough to think through this and connect with our heart on this. And it's also okay in that moment to say, hey, I need a minute to actually figure out what I want to say about this or how I want to be in this experience. And then accept that with yourself. Okay, it's okay that I'm here. I'm going to figure this out. It's expected that I would be here, because when we are kind of beside ourselves in that friend way, like a coach, it opens us up to the plane of possibility in our minds and allows us to think through what we actually want to say in a polite and respectful way. And then we need to explore the terrain a little bit. We need to kind of drop down into our bodies. So, okay, what are the sensations in my body? What are these images, any images in my mind, any thoughts I'm having? Because those are all clues, really important clues about how we want to authentically respond. And then once we're there, we may have a little bit more of an idea of a kind response as opposed to our standard nice response.
Take a moment.
Take a pause and explore the terrain.
Love that.
With acceptance and with compassion.
Yeah.
So a more concise way to say it is accept where you are, treat yourself with compassion, then explore everything going on in your body and in your mind, any images that are floating across your mind, any sensations in your body, flutteriness, tightness, openness, and any thoughts in your mind, and use those as clues to what you really have to say and contribute to the moment.
The takeaway from this episode, so many takeaways actually, but the biggest one, don't steal the bumper sticker, #push through the pushback, #integration nation.
Hashtag Please don't steal it. That's a boundary right there.
That is our boundary, and we are happy to lay it down. Do drop off your questions and your reviews and your 5-star rating for the episode and share it with someone you know that could use it.
Absolutely. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us. It matters a lot.
Allison Sullivan and Associates Integrative Mental Health Team is located in beautiful, historic downtown Fredericksburg, Virginia, and at allisonsintegrativehealth.org. New and exciting workshops are available to you that will give you personal attention to meet your needs right where you are on your journey. Sign up for our newsletter to be the first to know when registration opens for workshops like Aromatherapy 101. Here's how you can discover to use aromatherapy to support your health. Did you know that a blend of frankincense, peppermint, and lemongrass supports wisdom, optimism, and it will help you release unhealthy attachments? This is where you can learn how to support your mental, emotional, and physical health with the Essential Oils workshops available to you monthly for no charge. Come meet the team. Schedule your session today for psychotherapy, hypnotherapy, yoga, and massage, and begin restoring yourself in mind, body, and spirit. If you'd like to call, the number is 540-907-0991 and online at allisonsintegrativehealth.org. As Allison always says, self-care will save your life. Let go and lean in.